Hi, it's Ray Grant. It is Monday. I better make absolutely sure I'm rolling there. Yes, I guess I am. Uh, it is Monday, December 4th, 2023. It is 9:05 p.m. here in Pittsburgh. And this evening, tonight, I'm going to talk about the murder of Robert Salem, which is chapter, let's see where we go here. It's chapter 8 of my book. It's under the title South of Market. And Robert Salem would be the second um, secret, unannounced murder of the Zodiacs. If you want to consider Sherry Bates to be an announced murder, since she was acknowledged retroactively, but let's move forward with Robert Salem and see how far we get. South of Market, Robert Salem, 40, was a well-known lamp designer who lived and worked in a residence/studio in the 700 block of Stevenson Street. Remember, Michael O'Hare's office at Arthur D. Little was also on Stevenson Street in San Francisco. Not the same block, obviously. Robert Salem lived and worked in a residence studio in the 700 block of Stevenson Street, an alley behind the Hotel Whitcomb at 1231 Market Street. Before I go any further, I'm going to stop abruptly here, and I think there is I think the Hotel Whitcomb is at 1231 Market Street. Yep. Sorry about this. Try this again. Let me check on the 1231 Main Street. Okay. As far as I know, this has not been commented on because Robert Salem is generally not recognized as a Zodiac victim. However, the Hotel Whitcomb behind which Robert Salem's studio was, and where he was murdered, was at 1231 Market Street. The Napa Car Wash was at 1231 Main Street in Napa. This is 1231 Market is in San Francisco. 1231 Main is in Napa. The question is there a significance to 1231? Yes. $12.31, among other things, evokes the last day of the year. 12/31, the Gregorian calendar. December 31st is the last day of the year for us here in modern times. However, and obviously, for example, here in Squirrel Hill, which is a Jewish neighborhood, the Jews celebrate New Year traditionally in in our month of September. Yom Kippur, the same thing, and I believe the year in the Jewish calendar is like 5,700 something. But the last day of the year for us is 12/31. It's December 31st. The last day of the year for the Romans was February 23rd. So by using, and among other things, by using an address which was behind 1231 Market Street and using the Napa Car Wash as one of their locations for a phone call, that was at 1231 Main Street. That's one of the things that they were evoking. One of the themes that they were evoking was this idea of the last day of the year. And the terminus ceremony, where I would say generally animals were, I don't know if there was any human being sacrificing in the Roman pagan religion. There are many examples of that in other forms of paganism. But anyway, the Roman boundary stones would have been consecrated, sanctified on February 23rd, on 2/23. So this is another way of evoking that theme. I'm mentioning that now because I don't think I mentioned it in the course of the chapter. I may find out otherwise. So I'm going to have to start reading my own books. Robert Salem lived and worked in a residence/studio in the 700 block of Stevenson Street, an alley behind the Hotel Whitcomb at 1231 Market Street. On April 19th, On April 19th, 1970, keep in mind that I just talked about the Kathleen Johns abduction, which took place, began on March 22nd, 1970, and then spilled over into March 23rd, 1970. The discovery of Robert Salem's body took place on April 19th, 1970. Police responded to a complaint from people living in the rooms on the backside of the hotel of a horrible smell coming from the alley. When they investigated, they found Salem's nude body sprawled inside his apartment in the midst of a bloody scene reminiscent of a slaughterhouse. His killer or killers had turned the thermostat up to 90 degrees. Salem was stabbed multiple times and nearly decapitated. His left ear had been cut off. On the wall, printed in the victim's blood, were the words "Satan saves." An Egyptian ankh, A-N-K-H. I recently talked about the phoenix, which was a symbol in Egyptian mythology, among other mythologies. It's the same concept. An Egyptian ankh, A-N-K-H, was drawn near the name Zodiac. The same symbol was drawn in blood on the victim's stomach, though Robert Graysmith calls it a dripping red symbol of a crucified man. The killer apparently used the shower after the murder. It was as bloody and brutal a crime as one could imagine. The apparent brutality disguised a form of precision so unique it wasn't even noticed by the investigators. Okay, this section is called Stanley Dean Baker. A man named Stanley Dean Baker supposedly confessed to the murder to the California Highway Patrol, adding that he carried away Salem's ear because he was a cannibal. Any number of suspects in other cases have been convicted on nothing more substantial than their own confessions, but Stanley Baker was never even charged for the Salem murder. A reporter for USA Today wearily explained to me over the phone in the early 1990s that police also had Baker's fingerprints and blood at the scene. I tend to doubt that since Baker was never even charged in the Salem case, and bloody fingerprints tend to be convincing to most non-Simpson juries. Baker was charged and convicted of the 1970 murder of James Schlosser and ultimately paroled in 1986. No, I don't understand why either, but he was. He was even allowed to take up a new identity and one hopes a new diet in Wyoming. When James Schlosser's body was found, it was missing its head, heart, and several fingers, and all 4 of its limbs had been hacked off. The heart had presumably been eaten raw and whole by Stanley Dean Baker. Okay, he would say he had the Aztec ancestry, apparently. In contrast, there was no evidence of cannibalism at the Robert Salem crime scene, except perhaps for the missing ear, which may or may not have been eaten since there was no sign of it. If he did kill Robert Salem, Stanley Dean Baker apparently didn't find the rest of Salem's body appetizing. If he was such a compulsive cannibal, why wasn't he hungry that time? Another odd thing, James Schlosser was shot twice in the head before he was cannibalized. The chopping up of his body was post-mortem. Robert Salem wasn't shot, and his body wasn't chopped up. Additionally, when left to his own devices, Stanley Dean Baker clearly prefers to do his cannibalistic headhunting and body snatching in sparsely populated regions like Big Sur, Montana, and Wyoming. Apparently, there's more sport and more good eats to be had in the great outdoors. So what exactly would he have been doing in the South of Market district of San Francisco, which is so developed that they put 2 or 3 potted plants together and call it a park? Check out Portsmouth Square Park when you get a chance. I'll come to that location later on. Because the Robert Salem murder doesn't particularly resemble other Zodiac murders, they don't particularly resemble one another, but never mind that. SFPD looked at the name Zodiac on the wall and concluded the killer was a copycat. The problem is, if Stanley Dean Baker was the culprit, he doesn't seem to have copied his own previous homicide. Next section, Gary Allen Hinman. The Salem murder bears a much more striking resemblance to murders committed by the Manson family in 1969. In fact, in many respects, it is identical to the murder of Gary Allen Hinman, which was discovered on July 31st, 1969. Coincidentally, well, really not, the same day the Zodiacs mailed their first cipher to the newspaper, Z408. In 3 portions, one to the Vallejo Times-Herald, one to the San Francisco Examiner, and one to the San Francisco Chronicle. Hinman's face had been deeply slashed on the left side, his left ear cut off, and he had 2 stab wounds to the chest. Hinman's house had been ransacked, and the words political piggy were written on the wall in his blood next to a panther paw, also in blood. The panther paw was presumably meant to leave the impression that the Black Panthers had killed him. In both murders, the victim's left ear was cut off. In both murders, the killer or killers used the shower afterward. In both murders, words were written on the wall in the victim's blood. In both murders, a symbol was also drawn on the wall. It seems clear that the Salem murderers at the very least, borrowed ideas from the Hinman murderers. Okay, but interrupting here. Where have we heard that idea before of the Zodiac killers borrowing ideas from other crimes and from fiction? In the case of the Edwin Baird story, Sign Z. In the case of the Moonlight Murders in Texarkana. In the case of Domingos Edwards, where the victims were apparently were forced to tie each other up, or the female was forced to tie the male up. And there, I should probably do a separate video on that, but we've seen that idea before, and here it is again. SMPD called the Salem murder. Okay. It seems clear that the Salem murderers, at the very least, to reiterate, borrowed ideas from the Hinman murderers. SFPD called the Salem murder a copycat crime, meaning the killer's trying to make the homicide look like the work of the Zodiac, which is the only reason he wrote the word Zodiac on the wall. I think it is much more accurate to say the killers were copying the Hinman murder while affixing the Zodiac name to it. Okay? The Robert Salem murder doesn't resemble any of the Zodiac murders up to that point. Unless, well, with the possible exception of the Shelley Holmbo murder, which had immediately preceded it. But it didn't resemble any of the publicly acknowledged murders of the Zodiac killer. Instead, it resembled a Manson murder. Although it should be noted that Charles Manson's name wasn't attached to Gary Hinman murder immediately as being a Manson murderer. Okay. I think it is much more accurate to say, I'm copying myself here. I think it is much more accurate to say the killers were copying the Hinman murder while affixing the Zodiac name to it. So the question then becomes, was Stanley Dean Baker bright enough? The question becomes, was Stanley Dean Baker bright enough and organized enough? For the FBI, the level of organization is always the key issue when dealing with serial killers. To have consciously copied the Hinman murder, because whoever committed the Salem murder was consciously copying the Hinman murder. Was Stanley Dean Baker bright enough to do that? Maybe he was, I doubt it. Stanley Dean Baker was apprehended on suspicion of murder because he'd been driving James Schlosser's car. He'd been driving Schlosser's car on the wrong side of the road while speeding. Plus, he was found to have a human index finger in his pocket. We're talking about Stanley Dean Baker there. None of which sounds either particularly bright or particularly organized. Next section, a green-eyed monster. What motive would the Zodiacs have to copy the Gary Hinman murder? Gary Hinman's murder was discovered on July 31st, 1969, the same day the Zodiacs sent the three-part cipher Z408. Both stories would have appeared in the newspapers beginning the next day, except that only one of the three newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, actually ran its cipher portion on August 1st, 1969. In other words, Gary Hinman's murder scooped what was arguably the most significant mailing the Zodiac sent. Okay? For killers whose primary ambition was publicity in the newspapers, that might be motive enough for murder. In subsequent months, when the murders might have been front-page news throughout California, they were continually upstaged by the Manson murders, to say the very least. The Zodiacs had threatened to attack school buses, at least partly, to keep the Zodiac brand name in the news, both in print and on TV. The notoriety of the Manson murders greatly reduced the effect that threat might otherwise have had. By March 29th, 1970, when Robert Salem was murdered, the Zodiac case was notorious in the San Francisco Bay Area, but not so much in the rest of the state. It's almost as if the Zodiac were jealous of the press the Manson murders had been enjoying, and he then committed a near identical murder to the Hinman homicide in order to focus the spotlight back on himself. And again, if you go to Zodiac Killer message boards, what you find is that the anonymous posters, as I sometimes refer to them, the hobbyists, are constantly talking about the Zodiac's emotional state. Well, the Zodiac got mad after Z408 was solved so quickly, so he made like a much more difficult cipher, okay? That's not backed up by the cryptographic evidence anyway. I think, frankly, all this is too subtle a concept for someone like Stanley Dean Baker, or anyone else for that matter, other than the Zodiacs themselves. Of course, the colossal irony in all this is that had the police, press, and public realized that the Zodiac was actually four people constructing a complex puzzle, whose main purpose was to create a bogus serial killer named the Zodiac, they might have gotten the joke about their Frankenstein monster responding to his lack of press by copying the Mansons. Then again, maybe not. I leave the rest of the page blank there. That's just a coincidence. The next section is called Modeling Murderers. To demonstrate another aspect of this copying concept, I will take the reader back to two notorious murders committed on a beach in Southern California in 1963. You guys are completely familiar with this, but I might as well read it anyway. What the hell? In a Vallejo Times Herald story appearing on November 13th, 1972, Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office Bill Baker, retired, postulated that the murders of a young couple in northern Santa Barbara County might have been the work of the Zodiac Killer. On June 4th, 1963, high school senior Robert Domingos and fiancée Linda Edwards were shot dead on a beach near Lompoc, having skipped school that day for Senior Ditch Day. Police believe that the assailant attempted to bind the victims, but when they freed themselves and attempted to flee, the killer shot them repeatedly in the back and chest with a .22 caliber weapon. The killer then placed their bodies in a small shack and then tried, unsuccessfully, to burn the structure to the ground. Wikipedia. Interesting that after the murders were committed, the killer of Domingos and Edwards decided to burn the bodies. That's not funny, but it ties in with the idea of by fire. I've already demonstrated that the Zodiacs murdered Sherry Bates, David Faraday, and Betty Lou Jensen in what can best be characterized as tactical operations. I think it is clear from just a superficial overview of the murders in Santa Barbara that nothing at all like that was going on in the killings of Domingos and Edwards. However, in other words, the killings of Domingos and Edwards were relatively primitive compared to what the Zodiacs were doing, at least conceptually. However, the murders of the teenagers have been linked to the Zodiac because of similarities to what happened at one of his murder events. The Domingos Edwards killer used rope. The Zodiac at Lake Berryessa used hollow clothesline cord. Both used pre-cut pieces of rope/cord. Santa Barbara investigators came to the conclusion that Edwards was forced to tie Domingos up before the killer himself tied Edwards up. Okay, that's pretty much identical to what happened at Lake Berryessa. We know that the Zodiac had Cecilia Epper tie up Brian Hartnell and then tied up Shepard himself and then retied Hartnell himself when he realized Hartnell was too loosely tied. One striking difference between the two events is that the killer in Santa Barbara allowed Robert Domingos to get the drop on him. The Zodiac, on the other hand, was completely in command at Lake Berryessa and was not fooled by Cecilia's trick of tying Brian loosely, despite the killer's wearing a hood throughout. Also, it's clear that his intent in tying Hartnell and Shepard up was to allow him to stab the victims. It's not clear why the Santa Barbara killer wanted to tie the couple up, but his post-mortem exposure of Linda Edwards' breasts would seem to point to some sexual preoccupation. The Zodiac abruptly ceased his stabbing and walked up the road to Brian Hartnell's car and left a message, as if his every action from the time he donned the costume had been planned in advance. The Santa Barbara killer shot the fleeing victims and then dragged their bodies to the shack 30 feet away. He spent a fair amount of time trying to set the shack on fire, but was unable to, and eventually abandoned the bodies. Although the Zodiacs did not kill Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, their murders almost certainly served as models for the Zodiac Project. The Santa Barbara killer used a .22 rifle and Winchester Super X ammo. The Zodiacs used a .22 handgun in Lake Herman Road and Winchester Super X. Those are common items, but I do think the Zodiac used them at least partly because the Santa Barbara killer did. I believe all murders by the Zodiacs are based on previous murders that the conspirators chose to pattern their own crimes after. The Zodiacs borrowed individual elements from previous murders rather than copying entire murder events or modus operandi. Even the Salem murder wasn't a direct copy of the Hinman murder. This, by the way, is also true of their letters. For example, the Dear Melvin letter of December 20th, 1969 is very similar in tone to the message left by the lipstick killer, presumably William Hirons, in 1945. For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself. When the Zodiacs began their project, there wasn't the huge database on serial killers that's available now. Still, several of their murders allude to earlier killings. Faraday Jensen generally resembles the Texarkana Phantom or Moonlight murders from 1946 and features the same gun and ammunition as the Santa Barbara murders. Farron Magoo also generally resembles the Moonlight murders, which, by the way, were committed on weekends. Hartnell Shepard features a hooded killer like the Texarkana Phantom and a killer who tied his victims up with clothesline cord, similar to what the Santa Barbara killer attempted to do. The Robert Salem murder features several similarities to the Gary Hinman murder. The Shelley Holmboe murder resembles the Lindbergh kidnapping, in the sense that the infant died almost immediately after being abducted. The ransom notes sent by the Lindbergh kidnapper also resemble the Zodiac letters, generally in spelling and grammar, and the use of an odd symbol to identify the writer and connect the letters. One of the Lindbergh letters even features a rudimentary drawing reminiscent of the Zodiac bomb diagrams. And I don't know how visible that's going to be, but you can see, if you can see above there's a kind of like what looks like a box diagram, and then down below the Lindbergh kidnapper's symbol, which presumably was used to identify himself to the police in case there were hoax letters. They would know him by that symbol. So, but as I said, one of the Lindbergh kidnappers' letters actually featured a diagram, not really similar, certainly not similar in complexity, to what was sent by the Zodiac killer in his Bob diagrams, but similar in the sense that they were both diagrams that were being sent to police. To be clear, I'm saying the Lindbergh case may have been an inspiration for the Zodiacs, particularly in the form their letters took. I want the reader to consider something else. Very often, when an anonymous writer sends a random note or threatening letter, he does so by using cutout phrases from a newspaper. The Zodiac himself does this in two of his mailings: the whole card of October 5th, 1970, and the Lake Tahoe card of March, or the Sierra Club card of March 22nd, 1971. The Zodiacs did something similar in their crimes. They used cutouts of previous crimes to make up their own murders. It's the same idea. They were creating a collage, in effect. If the Zodiac Project is art, then the murders are collages. They take an impression from the Texarkana Phantom, an echo of the Santa Barbara killer, an image from the Lindbergh case, a theme from the Manson murders, and create a montage of murder. This has two primary effects. A, it blurs their own identities, and B, it creates an emotional distance from the crimes. In other words, if you're copying somebody else, this is true even in art. If I do a parody of Picasso on canvas, in effect, I am distancing myself from the artifact, because your first reference to it is Picasso, not to whoever the artist is. So it creates an emotional distance from the crimes. A typical serial killer's murders are up close and personal. The murders committed by the Zodiacs are impersonal, because the murders have nothing to do with either who the victims are or who the killers are, except figuratively. In other words, they are creating a construct in time and space, okay? It isn't emotional, it's not personal, if that makes sense. Which is odd, because they were locating victims and choosing victims because of properties their names had, and in some cases because of locational identification. However you want to put that, the availability of victims. But the murders themselves were impersonal. Pierre Badu said something like, in the Zodiac Killer, this is the Zodiac speaking documentary, he said, I believe that the FBI statistics are something along the lines of 80, I don't know what he says, 86%, 88% of murder victims knew their killers. In other words, most murders are personal on some level or another. Even road rage is in effect is personal, because it has to do with the emotional state of the killer, and sometimes of the victim as well. The Zodiac murders were impersonal. They were all done simply to make a point and to provide a demonstration for the public. In the confession letter, the Zodiacs say, she is not the first and she will not be the last. I made this point already. They don't mean that Sherry Bates isn't the first victim. She is. They mean that the Sherry Bates murder isn't the first co-ed murder, and it won't be the last. They are simply using what looks on the surface to be a conventional co-ed murder to create their own construction. They mean that they are using fragments from previous murders and fictitious murders in some cases to present their tableau the way an artist selects colors from a palette. The Zodiacs don't have a motive in terms of anything they get from their victims. Each murder is a fresh blank canvas, and they aren't compelled to do anything. Their murders are cold-blooded and clinical and carefully orchestrated. No killer who gets into the front seat of a cab to hack off the dead driver's shirt so he can send swatches of it in his letters to the newspapers is being driven by his basic urges. No urge is more basic than self-preservation, and yet the Zodiac risks capture in the service of art direction. There has never been another serial killer, not even the ones who wrote to the police and newspapers, who killed purely because he wanted publicity. If those other serial killers had never sent any messages, they would still have committed their murders. In contrast, the Zodiacs make it clear from the very beginning that the murders are secondary, merely a means to an end. The end is the messages, or to put that more succinctly, the message. And I think that may, yeah, okay, I go on to State Line from there. I am not, I don't think, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to make money narrating biblical, like, who was there was that actor, Alexander Skirby, who is known for doing a narration of the Bible. And and it came to pass that Abraham, went out into, or I guess Moses went into the desert. But anyway, he had a great voice. So Larry King once said he was talking to some guy who had called in and wanted to get into radio, and Larry said, "Well, I can tell right away you don't have the well modulated voice that they're looking for. I doubt seriously that anyone would hire me, and if they did hire me, it wouldn't have been during during the point when I was. Today's the 4th, and my injections are December 7th. Today's Monday the 4th. My injections are Thursday, December 7th at 3 p.m. So set your watches for that time. It's 3 p.m. Eastern time, by the way, here in the United States. They certainly wouldn't have scheduled me for any narration during my deteriorating voice. But what's amazing is I haven't started croaking yet. Okay. Although I will croak at some time in the future, just as the Zodiac killers will croak at some time, and you out there will croak at some time in the future. It's inevitable. But that's a difference. That's figurative croaking versus literal croaking. Anyway, the idea behind the Robert Salem, one of the ideas is that the Manson murders pretty much took over and became what the Zodiac killers wanted their murders to become, which is this gigantic, what's the word? The Manson murders took over not just TV and print and books and everything, but they also took over the culture. Okay, in other words, the Zodiac killing now in as we speak in 2023, the Zodiac may actually be a more famous serial killer than Charles Manson was, but that's only because Manson and his followers were, and we still talk about them. I was just talking about Ken Maines, the problem that both Ken Maines and myself have had with the continued incarceration of Leslie Van Houten. Okay, she would have been paroled half a lifetime ago if she were just if she were not connected to the Manson murders, because. We're not excusing what she did, but if you compare her to other people who have been paroled, she'd have been paroled, 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. Her activity within the context of the Manson murders was absolutely minimal. She basically had to be forced to participate in the LaBianca murders. And nothing that she did had anything to do with the death of Mrs. LaBianca. Instead, she ends up being incarcerated for whatever it was, 50 years. I would say it would be almost impossible to find an inmate somewhere who had been in jail for 25 years for doing the same amount of damage that Leslie Van Houten did. But she, unfortunately for her, and I do think that it was an injustice that she was incarcerated far beyond the amount of time that would be normal for what she did. Okay, the only thing that kept her in jail was her connection to um, the Manson murders. Now, what's interesting is that Patricia Krenwinkel has also been paroled, although in Krenwinkel's case, the governor of California has not allowed her to be released. Leslie Van Houten has been released. And again, it's not, I don't think myself or Ken Maines is excusing what either of those two women did. We're just saying if you believe in the process, then they should have been. Paroled a long time ago. No, Patricia Krenwinkel is a much more problematical case, obviously, than Leslie Van Houten. But anyway, the point to be made here is that not only were the Manson murders taking over the newspapers and TV in a way that the Zodiacs wanted to take over, and again, I am not suggesting here that the Zodiacs reacted emotionally to the presence of the Manson murders, but the Manson murders took over in the same sense that what I was talking about when I went down over the sequence of events that led to the Zodiac Project, which is that the Zodiac Project is a commentary on the culture, just as we began with, and probably before this, but Jack the Ripper, and Harry K. Thaw, and Sacco and Vanzetti, and Leopold and Loeb, who obviously the Zodiac murders are closest in comparison, perhaps, to the Leopold and Loeb murder in the sense that it's an example of intellectuals deciding to commit a notorious murder and presumably get away with it. The Zodiacs did get away with it, or at least so far. And I don't think they're necessarily, and even if they are perspiring a little bit because of my videos here, Gareth Penn will shortly be 83 years old, and Michael O'Hare will be 81. So I mean, they've largely gotten away with it in the same sense that when I talked about John Sippos, to a large extent, John Sippos got away with the murder of Mary Scott. He was caught when he was 76 years old by forensic DNA, genetic genealogy DNA profiling. Or tracing, I should say. But the point to be made here is that the Manson murders upstaged the Zodiac murders in a way that the Zodiacs could not have seen coming. And so you had Jack the Ripper, you had Harry Thaw, you had Sacco and Vanzetti, you had Leopold and Loeb, you had the Lindbergh kidnapping, you had film noir back in the 1940s. You had the addition of television coverage to murder sprees like Starkweather, and like the clutter murders essentially became more of a PR story than more a story about the culture and things like the New Yorker magazine and Truman Capote's book, which was a nonfiction novel, than it did about the actual murders, which were, home invasions happen on a daily basis. Okay, so but the clutter murders were brought to the culture and turned into a cultural artifact by the presence of Truman Capote. Okay. And then, as I said, you had movies like Psycho, which did the same thing. Essentially, you're watching a movie that's about Janet Leigh and the problems she's having and so forth. And suddenly, halfway through the movie is hijacked by a psychopath. Okay. And so that aspect of popular culture, of pop art, was being commentated upon by the Zodiac killers. Okay, so it is ironic that the Zodiac killers were then upstaged by the Manson murders. and the Manson murders, which obviously were infinitely more primitive than what the Zodiac killers were doing. Yet the Mansons, the arrest of the Manson family, and the trials and so forth had taken over. And the same, we will see something similar in 1974 when they send the SLA letter. Okay, it's this idea of somebody who wants publicity, who is the Zodiac killer, reacting emotionally to the fact that the competition is getting more publicity than he's getting. Okay, so again, I don't think that the Zodiacs reacted emotionally to that. It was just the Robert Salem murder was in effect a further commentary of theirs on the cultural impact of murder, of notorious murder. Okay, and that is one of the basic themes of our lives. I just talked about the JFK assassination. Eventually, when I'm done commentating on the Zodiac murders, if that ever happens, it will probably never happen, but at some point I may run out of material. As difficult as that may be for you to believe, those of you who are watching my videos, at some point, Ray Grant may actually run out of material on the Zodiac case. Even I don't believe that, but I mean, it's theoretically possible. So, but when that eventuates, then I will go into some of my thoughts about the JFK assassination. And part of the reason for that is the most significant thing that has happened, other than the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, in terms of the world, and that was obviously JFK was the main was one of the main characters in that event. But the most significant things that have happened, the two most significant things that have happened in my lifetime have been the Cuban Missile Crisis and the JFK assassination. Because the JFK assassination, it's like watching one of those commercials about investment banks where they show the person walking around and he's following this arrow on the floor. You know, go here, do this, do that, and history's arrow was going in this direction. Suddenly, Jack Kennedy was assassinated, and it went off in this direction instead. I believe what Jeff Greenfield has said about Jack Kennedy and Vietnam, which is that he would not have committed active troops to Vietnam, assuming nothing catastrophic happened during 1964. He would have waited to be reelected, and then he would have withdrawn our advisors from Vietnam. Of course, again, this is reconstructing history is never easy. You can go back and look at Korea and draw parallels to the situation in Vietnam. Korea looked very similar back in the I guess the late 1940s to the way Vietnam looked, and look at Korea now. I mean, South Korea is a a very powerful ally, and it's they have their own impact on civilization, and a tremendous price was paid for that. But now you have South Korea. You have my favorite video. We're watching a YouTube video now. My favorite video unfortunately wasn't on YouTube, was on Reddit, was a video about the unofficial Chinatown in Seoul, South Korea, where you're basically the lady who was doing the narration, and she had a camera, and she just went through the marketplace in Chinatown. It's just I just love things like that. I love examples of civilization where you're walking through little markets, and you're walking through, like we have the Strip District here in Pittsburgh, okay, where you go down and you're walking down Liberty Avenue, and there's Woolies in the Strip. I almost wore my Woolies cap. Maybe I'll wear that like in the next video. Where you walk into the store and they have like fish on the one side, and they're selling fresh fish, and they actually have a tank where the fish are swimming around, and everybody's waiting for lunch basically to have a fish sandwich. And there are scenes in my novel which take place in Woolies in the Strip because I love that place so much. But it's, again, what you got for the sacrifice in Korea was civilization. You got the things that I care about, which is peace, and you got commerce, and you got just in markets, and street fairs, and that sort of thing. Okay, so all of that is to go back and ask, what would have happened with the negatives of JFK pulling out of Vietnam. But what happened in Vietnam was horrible. But again, what happened in Korea was just as horrible, really. The only difference is that the United States didn't go in there and basically act like in an insensitive manner, and so many millions of Vietnamese died over there. But what I'm talking about here is the effects on the culture when a catastrophic crime takes place, like the Kennedy assassination. Like, one man, in my belief, See, I'm not a conspiracy theorist across the board. I believe Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. I'll probably get some negative comments down there because that's such a line of demarcation between people, and most people believe there was some sort of conspiracy. I don't. But essentially, one man changed the world. Okay, and he wasn't a significant person at all. He just happened to be in the right place at the right time to do it. But again, that had a very catastrophic effect on the pop culture. And essentially, one of the great ironies of the Zodiac case is that while the Zodiacs were trying to set up this notorious serial killer called the Zodiac, they were upstaged by the Manson family. And it has only been since the David Fincher movie. First of all, the stopping of the Terminus event from taking place, okay, because that would have had a tremendous impact. But in recent years, with the Fincher movie and the Zodiac killer becoming, I've complained about the fact. I complained to Ned DeHaan, in fact. I'm not, by the way, I'm not watching Ned's videos, so I have no idea what's going on over there. And I don't look at Tom's message board. I still go to Tom's site, obviously for his research, but I never look at his board. I don't look at Ned's channel, and I don't look at the Zodiac Killer subreddit. So it's a distraction. I don't need it. I'm better off just concentrating on what I'm doing. Okay, but as I complained to Ned about the Zodiac Killer, the fact that the Zodiac Killer case has become a Jack the Ripper means that I can't access investigators anymore. Now, keep in mind, most of the original investigators are dead. I mean, let's go down to the people that I've spoken with in detail. I don't know about Daryl Bressler. He was the fire investigator for the state of California. But Fred Chirisago is the head of the Zodiac investigation for the DOJ in California. Has been dead for years. George Bayward, who I spoke with numerous times back in '91, has been dead. Melvin Belli has been dead for years. Roy Conway may still be alive. But even if you talk to the original investigators or the original Mary Pilker, Donna Lass's sister, is dead. A lot of these people have passed away, and that's another aspect of pop culture, which is that the world moves on. And as I pointed out, now you can be a mass murderer of, you know, numerous times what people did 50 years ago, and people don't even know who you are because the world has moved on, and they don't. It doesn't have the same effect on the culture that it did because it's too common an event. Let's talk about Robert Salem. First of all, the name Salem is, we associate that with the Salem witch trials. Generally speaking, and I could be wrong about this, but the people who were the targets of that were like young women, and I think they were targets partly because of Puritanism, because young women were seen as being as a threat to religious devotion. But what we have with Robert Salem is this triptych, if you will. It's similar to the religious paintings back during the Renaissance, which is, let me see if I can. Do I need the bigger thing? Maybe I can do it with a smaller one. I don't know. All right, we're going to do. Shelley Holmboe, Robert Salem, and Donna Lass. Okay, those three people. Actually, I think I'm going to have room, so I think I'm going to make those a little bit larger than they are. Okay. A little bit bigger. Shelley Holmboe, Robert Salem, Donna Lass. Okay. Shelley Holmboe was murdered on October 19th, 1969. Donna Lass was murdered September 6th, kidnapped and murdered September 6th, 1970. Ray Grant has, Robert Salem murdered March 29th, 1970. Now, since his body was discovered on April 19th, 1970. Is there any basis for believing that? Okay. Yeah. I think the fact that Salem's body was discovered because it had started to smell so badly that people on the backside of the Whitcomb Hotel began to complain, and I'm assuming that their first complaints were kind of ignored, and eventually there was enough of a multiple complaints that this situation was looked into. It is reasonable to assume that Robert Salem was murdered a significant amount of time prior to the discovery of his body, which was on April 19th, 1970. That seems to me. Again, I could be wrong about that. I am placing his murder on March 29th, 1970 for a reason. And again, I invite people to dispute that if they so choose. October 19th, 1969 was a Sunday. So was March 29th, 1970. So was September 6th, 1970. Okay? Why am I choosing March 29th, 1970 as the probable murder date of Robert Salem? It's because that date in 1970 was Easter Sunday. Okay? So that's when I believe that Salem was murdered. It is possible that the Zodiacs fudged that date. However, it is the central date of those three dates. This is the same amount of time as this is. Okay? In each of those instances, we're talking about a gap of 161 days. All three events took place on a Sunday. Shelley Holmbo was murdered October 19th, 1969. 161 days later, on Easter Sunday, March 29th, 1970, Robert Salem was murdered. That's a gap of exactly 23 weeks. 161 days later, Donna Lass was murdered September 6, 1970. Again, that's a gap of 23 weeks. So the overall passage in time between the Shelley Holmbo murder and the Donna Lass abduction and murder was 46 weeks. So it's 223. And it's assuming that Easter Sunday was the midpoint between those two. It's 23 weeks. Easter Sunday, 23 weeks. Whether Salem was actually murdered that date or not, or they fudged the date. The central time would have been Easter Sunday, 1970, and it's 223s, 23 weeks, 23 weeks. Again, we know Shelley Holmbo died October 19th, 1969. We know Donna Lass disappeared September 6, 1970. Salem's body was discovered April 19th, 1970. I believe at least the intent was to murder him on March 29th, 1970, because that was Easter Sunday. That gives you this triptych. 161 days, 161 is 300, a gap of 322 days, but it's 23 and 23. 23 weeks followed by 23 weeks. And as I said, during the Renaissance, the post-Renaissance, the classical period, well, I would say more during the Renaissance, what you had in art was this idea of triptychs, where you have a central panel and two side panels, a side panel on each side, and you would have a triptych painting. So that's what the idea was of using Robert Salem who was intended to, in effect, be an answer to the notoriety of the Manson murders, and the lead into those were, or the triptych of that was Shelley Humbo, Robert Salem, Donald Lass. So it's in effect it's an artistic triptych of the other. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, I made this point over. I made the point about the 1231 and 223, and this is what I'm about to tell you is pure speculation. But let's do this. I was born at 329 West 29th Street, New York City, Sunday, April 29th, 1951. 329 West 29th Street, the French Hospital, New York, New York. It was a large maternity hospital. Many thousands of people were born there. It is possible that Michael O'Hare was born in the same building I was. New York, New York, 10001. 10001 equals binary 17. Okay? So, if you were trying, among other things, to evoke that, my mother was born on March 14th, which a lot of people call Pi Day, for example, coincidentally enough. Part of the significance of March 29th, 1970, besides being Easter Sunday, is that it's 329. So if Robert Salem was murdered on March 29th, Easter Sunday, that would be a way of evoking, if Michael O'Hare was born in the same maternity hospital where I was born, that would be a way of evoking 329. Again, whether they did that or not, or the exact location of Michael O'Hare's birth is not known to me, but it is certainly well within the range of possibility. Plus, we know when I showed you the undertext of the final 18 letters of Z408, I pointed out that Seeger times 2 is 146 because Alan Seeger was born on 73rd Street. Okay. So the Zodiacs, among other things, among other numerical preoccupations, were preoccupied with this example that that the numbers associated with one's birth, and in Alan Seeger's case with 73rd Street, perhaps in Michael O'Hare's case with 329 West 29th Street, that those numbers would be significant above most other numbers. But anything that has to do with personal identification, like the address, your birth date, the address of your birth, your social security number, all of those numbers were of interest to them in evoking an identity, in essentially in telling the public who they were without doing it in a conventional means. So that, for example, when they send cipher material to the public assumes that the information is going to be in the plain text of the cipher. Well, maybe not. Maybe the information will be in the form of the cipher. Okay. And again, that would be an example of what, street magicians do, where they're hiding in plain sight. And in fact, they're showing you something. They're showing you their hand and you don't see it because you're looking someplace else. You're preoccupied with some other aspect of the presentation. I am officially out of hot chocolate, by the way, so didn't have much to begin with. That's from this morning. I think that's it as far as Robert Salem goes. I may touch on, let me see here. I may touch on other aspects of his murder, but and by the way, I remember being laughed at on Mike Butterfield's board because I assumed that because the word Zodiac was written on the wall in Robert Salem's blood, that necessarily meant that the Zodiac committed the murder. And again, the Salem murder was a murder that the Zodiacs were not going to acknowledge. They were only going to acknowledge the canonical murders, okay? Unless somebody came out as they did with the Riverside murder, and then he might acknowledge the murder, or in the case of the Kathleen Johns kidnapping, they felt that it was important that, and again, the Kathleen Johns kidnapping was attributed to the Zodiac, or possibly to the Zodiac in some newspaper articles. So, but the Salem murder probably wasn't going to. That was not going to happen, so that the only way that they could get an attribution out of that and a connection out of that would be to write the word Zodiac on the wall, and that's what they did. They were, and I think that they probably expected that murder to be considered a copycat murder, but maybe not. This will be what actually happened, and obviously why they did things and what choices they made, and what murders didn't happen because of choices that they made. Will be very interesting if we ever find those things out, or the two Zodiacs may decide to take all this information with them and somehow The public has not demonstrated its worthiness to find out what actually happened. But it will be interesting if I'm still around when that happens to find out exactly why they did what they did and what the structure of the whole thing is. And again, as I said in my original book, I'm sure that I'm wrong about some things, about some aspects of the case, and I'm sure that I've gone off into, let me see what that's, okay, about 115. I'm sure that I've gone off on tangents here and there, that perhaps had absolutely nothing to do with what they were doing. Um, but that all of that is, I will presumably find out at some point, or not. So, but as I said, it will be interesting. It will be interesting to find out what I was right about, what I was wrong about. I'm sure that I'm right in about my general view of the case, why they did what they did and what they were doing. But not I'm not sure about every single detail. But I do present the things that I'm reasonably sure about, and I am reasonably sure that Robert Salem was. Oh, here's another very quick aspect of the Salem murder. I don't need to mention this now, but I might as well. Um, I don't mention it in the. I'm not sure I even mentioned this in the book. I mentioned it in my original book, not. Okay. If you draw a radian on the apex of Mount Diablo, VABM Mount Diablo 3849, you have a BRSP location just above the North Lake. You have the LHR Lake Herman Road location just above the North Lake. You have the South Lake intersecting Washington and Cherry Street down here. You have the South Lake intersecting BM 54 at 739 Clay Street, and that's at Kearney Street. I think I forget what I said the other time, but it's the Portsmouth Square Park garages are on Kearney Street in San Francisco, and it would be, I believe, the 700 block of Kearney Street is where they are, and that's where Donna Lass's body is buried. But we have this angle here, and I'm not sure which direction I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not sure which. So sue me if I'm wrong about this, but we will do it this way just for the heck of it. I have the subradian going west. It may actually have gone east. Again, you guys can sue me if I turn out to be wrong. But anyway, the location of Robert Salem's apartment is a subradian off the south leg of the Mount Diablo radian, and it is an exact subradian. Okay, there isn't any fudging involved. They had to do fudging up here. There's no fudging down here. It's 57.29 degrees uh, beneath the South Radian. That's where the location of Robert Salem's home, and I think it was 754 Stevenson Street, and that's where his body. That's where he was murdered. So Robert Salem's murder um, effectively denotes the south leg of the Mount Diablo radian by being a subradian off the south leg. Okay, again, that's another reason to believe that Robert Salem was a Zodiac victim, and I I have that. I had that illustration in my original book back in 1990. I'm not sure that I have it in this thing. And I will, just for the hell of it, let me see if I. Kathleen Johns. I have a feeling I don't have it because it wasn't in with the. Okay, I don't see it. It's possible it was not included. It's possible that illustration was not actually included in my 2015 book, but this is what it is. It's and again, it may be the angle may be to the east rather than to the west. I put it to the west to because I had room, and I've got this stuff like in the way, so I put the west. It may be going in that direction, but Robert Salem's murder scene was a subradiant off the south leg of the Mount Diablo radiant. That is another reason to believe that murder was committed by the Zodiacs. And let me see, where are we now? We're at. Okay, I think that's 123. Okay. Well, this can be a shorter video, no problem there. Anyway, to reiterate about Robert Salem, I believe that Robert Salem was, on one level, a demonstration piece. The Zodiacs were reacting emotionally to the relative lack of publicity compared to the Manson murders by committing a murder that was virtually identical to the first Manson murder. And obviously, I'm sure I'm going to have people come out and say, "Well, wait a minute, nobody knew that the Hinman murder was a Manson murder at the end of July, at the beginning of August, because they hadn't committed the Tate LaBianca murders yet. No, but by the time Robert Salem was murdered, the Manson murders and the notoriety from all of that had long been dominating the papers in California. And although the Zodiac got a great deal of publicity in the San Francisco Bay Area, uh, he did not get the amount of publicity he might have gotten if there had been no Manson murders. So, as far as I can tell, that was the reasoning behind committing the Robert Salem murder. The murder site is a subradian off the south leg. The positioning of the murder in the calendar it would be whether it was in point of fact directly between the murders of Shelley Holmbo and Donna Lass. Those two murders cause a span of 46 weeks. They both happened on Sunday, and they were 46 weeks apart. So, to the extent that the Robert Salem murder bisects that time, then it created the expression of 223. And the next thing that I will talk about will be, the Donna Lass murder, and I will talk about some of the same themes involving that. But again, Robert Salem was a response to to some extent, although I'm guessing that a murder was scheduled for around that time, and the construction of the structure of what they did wasn't going to change. Just as I've talked about, the transposition scheme of Z340 didn't change. I believe that was set before they even sent Z408. I think, as Gareth Penn has said, those two ciphers were constructed at the same time. So Z340 was not a response to the relatively quick solving of Z408, because they had already intended to send a transpositional cipher. The content of the cipher changed as a result of Eric Weil calling in on the Channel 7 show. And that would not have been particularly difficult to plug in a slightly different message in the plain text. So it was the same idea. Same idea with the Robert Salem murder. They may have planned some other type of murder, or to make some other point as that central murder, or conceivably not make one and just have the 46 weeks between the murders of Shelley Holmbo and Donna Lass speak for itself. But I tend to believe that Easter Sunday 1970 was intentionally a midpoint between those two other murders, and that the Robert Salem murder was just an example of, like, for example, the SLA letter, which was a response to what was going on in the culture already. And obviously, the Zodiac killers, when they set out, couldn't have known about the Terrence Malick film Badlands. Couldn't have known about The Exorcist. They couldn't have known about Count Marco back in 1966. I don't think he was operating back then. Okay, but part of what they were doing was what pop artists were doing, which is to respond to what's going on in the culture. I mean, Andy Warhol was using Campbell soup cans and Marilyn Monroe as artifacts of things to base his art upon. And the same thing with Roy Lichtenstein with pop art, which was based upon comic book panels. It's the same idea. It's basically you take what's going on in the popular culture and you copy it or you clone it or you make a collage out of it, and that becomes your art. It's the what who is the guy, George, the guy who used to do like plaster people, I forget his name now, George something or other. But it's the same idea. It's what was going on in the 1960s in the art world. And what the Zodiacs did was eventually, or what the Zodiacs did eventually became similar to what is known as the dark avant-garde, with people like Chris Burden and Robert Mapplethorpe, where you were delving into more darker ideas and elements, but again, all of those things were in the culture already. It isn't as if the Zodiacs were creating those negative images, okay? But in what made the Zodiacs different is that they were actually going out and killing people. Real people were actually dying. It wasn't just they weren't doing they weren't exactly doing performance art, because real people were dying in that. But that's again, that was the artistic choice, and they obviously would not have had the impact that they had if they had just been if they had just abducted people and then painted their faces or something like that. That wouldn't those things would have been maybe acknowledged as pranks. But I mean, part of the reason that Christo became the level of artist that he wasn't killing people, but his art disrupted normal commerce. Okay, he wanted to wrap the Brooklyn Bridge. He did create the gates in Central Park. Okay, and so in that sense, he was doing something negative, although he wasn't actually killing people, but he was disrupting society. Okay, for a whimsical idea. In the case of the Zodiac Killers, they were doing something very similar. It's conceptual art. That's what it is. That's always what it is. And the choice on the part of people on Zodiac Killer message boards to deny that is neither here nor there. That's what it is. This is what it will always be. This is what the Zodiac Killer case will always be, whether those people like it or not. This is what it is. This is what the Zodiac Killers were doing. Okay, and my hope is that this is becoming more evident as I go along in this video series. Maybe not, but I hope eventually to find my audience and to find a big enough audience that there will be a significant acceptance of these ideas. And as a result of that, I mean, I don't compare myself to Galileo, mind you, but Galileo's idea of the Earth going around the sun was rejected at the Copernicus had already made that argument, but Copernicus, I guess, was smart enough to make it just before he died, so he didn't have to live with the consequences. But Galileo, unfortunately, did have to live with the consequences. And then, as Arthur Schopenhauer once said, he said, all great ideas go through three phases. First, they are ridiculed. Then they're violently opposed. Okay. And then they are accepted as self-evident. Okay. So we haven't gotten to the self-evident phase fortunately, I haven't run into any physical violence anyway. I have a lot of verbal violence on Zodiac Killer message boards and YouTube channels. But I have found my own little niche here, so those people can't get to me or can't get to me very long. And before I get to them, and remove whatever they say. I am always I'm always wondering whether I should just remove a comment or hide the person from my channel. The problem with hiding somebody from your channel is the person doesn't know that his comment has been removed because it looks like it's still up. To everybody else, it's gone. But to that person, by the way, if you've been heckling me, you might want to check sign out of your YouTube profile and just go to the site anonymously and see if your comment is still up, because there's a very good chance it isn't and that you have been hidden from the channel. If your comment is not up when you're not logged in, it means I pressed the hide from channel button. But again, I don't like to do that because it's better just to press the remove button, because that way the person knows that their heckle has been removed. And that's basically why I do it. Or if somebody posts a comment that doesn't make any sense to me and I have no idea why this person has bothered to put this up there, you know. Anyway, and I am imperfect, so I mean, maybe I'm wrong when in doing that in some cases. So, you know, but what are you going to do? Anyway, this concludes the talk on Robert Salem. I'm sure I will mention him again in future episodes. I believe in the next episode I will probably talk about Donna Lass. Thanks very much for watching my video. I hope you have found this of interest. And I will, as soon as I get the insertion point into the point there, yeah. Again, thanks again. I will talk to you soon.